Whereas Chapter 6 of Informing with the Case method focused on research cases, in Chapter 7, my focus is almost entirely on writing discussion cases for classroom use. So in this chapter summary, what I'm going to cover first is why bother writing discussion cases. And this is particularly true for the academic audience because discussion cases will not necessarily move you in the direction of promotion and tenure at a lot of research institutions. The next topic will be thinking about how to choose a case site and a topic for a discussion case. We'll talk about some of the common plot lines for discussion cases. We'll talk about the outline for a traditional discussion case, which has some fairly standard formats, much like research cases did. We'll talk about writing for your intended audience, the case approval process, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about the teaching note, which is sometimes beneficial when you create a discussion case. So I would be the last person in the world to suggest that writing discussion cases is going to have a huge positive impact on your career in and of itself. I think that it can be part of a very fulfilling research career, but nevertheless, discussion cases at the moment are not terribly highly regarded by top research institutions. So the question is, why would you write one? Well, I think there are a number of reasons why you might consider writing a discussion case. The first is there's nothing that energizes a class more than using a case that you have written in the class. And this is particularly true when you bring in the decision maker, which is almost always going to be a possibility the first time you facilitate a discussion case in the classroom that you have written. So as far as I see, this is a big advantage in and of itself. And for me, it will probably be enough of an advantage to keep me writing the cases. But there are a lot of other things that accrue from writing a discussion case. One of these is it increases the researcher's knowledge of practice. And if it's a case for your class, that's saying it's going to make you more knowledgeable of what's going on in practice. That should make you a better instructor, and it should also make you more relevant to local businesses. It helps you develop your observational skills. Even if your ultimate goal in life is not writing discussion cases is a good way to build the observation skills that will allow you to go into more complicated research cases and be an effective researcher. These skills do not necessarily evolve spontaneously, and they certainly don't evolve naturally in the course of our traditional doctoral training. But going out there and practicing case writing can be a very good way of developing those skills. Finally, it can allow you to develop personal and institutional networks. When you're writing discussion cases, you're building relationships. And it is through relationships like this that ideas can flow back and forth between practice and academics. I believe that diffusion should be one of the major objectives of academic research, diffusion to practice. Writing discussion cases is a natural way of achieving that type of diffusion, much more natural than writing articles in academic journals. So as I've mentioned in previous chapters, one of the first stages of case writing processes is choosing a site and topic. And what I would suggest from my own experience is that this is not necessarily that difficult. It sounds very intimidating when you do it for the first time, but actually, once you've gotten used to doing it, it's often fairly straightforward. With respect to choosing a site, what you want to do is you want to choose a site where you think that there's a good chance you're going to be dealing with a topic of relevance. In my case, a lot of times I'm developing cases in information systems, or right now I'm developing a series in cybersecurity. So I want sites that are likely to have relevance to that. Now, in the case of something like cybersecurity, that could be a cybersecurity company dealing with any type of decision whatsoever, because just the milieu is of interest to cybersecurity. Or it could be a company experiencing a cybersecurity related decision, what software to buy, how to deal with an attack, and so forth. You want a site where you've got access to top management. You don't want to write the case and then have the company decide that it can never be released. And logistical considerations. Now, when I was at Harvard, they had a huge budget for case researchers, even doctoral students, which I was at the time. So your backyard was the entire world. Here at the University of South Florida, in the Muma College of Business, I'm considerably more constrained in terms of what I can spend. So as a consequence, I tend to focus on local companies whenever I can, which makes the cost of developing the case negligible. I will, however, say that the other advantage of local companies is when you actually create your networks. Obviously, the more local companies, the better it is for your students. Now, in terms of choosing the topic, when you're building a discussion case, you've got to find the right decisions. So typically, you find an individual who would be a good central figure for the case. You want a true decision. You don't want a set of choices where there's an obvious right answer and the protagonist isn't really making a decision. You want to find something that he or she is really thinking about. And obviously the decision has to fit with your objectives. And usually you find something that works reasonably well if you've chosen a site that's at all relevant. If you choose a site that doesn't have a computer and you're dealing with a cybersecurity case, you might have trouble finding a relevant decision. But if you choose your site well, usually you can find an interesting decision. And you really want it to be of interest to the protagonist because you're going to be going in asking a lot of questions, taking up people's time. If he or she feels that there's value that they can gain from your presence, then they're going to be a lot more tolerant of that than if they believe they're just doing it to help you in some abstract way with your research. Discussion cases tend to have kind of distinct plot lines, and most discussion cases, not all, but most discussion cases tend to fall into one of three categories. The first category is the choice case, where you're presenting a decision that involves a choice between, alternatives that are usually well articulated or relatively easy to figure out from the case. And this particular type of case provides experience in evaluation. And as I mentioned, cases tend to focus on judgment when you're dealing with discussion cases. So the choice case, I would say, is by far the most common scenario. And I tend to use choice cases almost exclusively when I'm dealing, say, at the undergraduate level, because they don't really have the background necessarily to come up with their own sophisticated alternatives in most, but not all cases. For example, if I were doing a case study on an undergraduate trying to make a career choice after he or she graduated, I might very well let the class come up with alternatives as part of the discussion, because that's a domain where they have given some serious thought and might have some expertise. Another type of case is the sense-making case. This can sometimes be very effective. The principal goal of these cases is kind of to frame the decision and consider all the forces involved, and it provides a nice opportunity to introduce analytical frameworks. The problem is it often does not have a very clear decision. And I've had a couple of cases that I use that are sense-making cases. I particularly use them in more advanced classes. And the idea here is to get a decision that doesn't make sense, seem to make sense, or vice versa, take a sensible decision and show why in the context it probably did not make sense. But this is kind of a post-mortem organization, and I wouldn't use it that often because you don't want your case discussions to be built around critiquing other people's decision-making. If that's the purpose of your case, for one thing, it's going to have a tough time getting it released, and for the second time, it's going to be teaching your students that the important thing to do in business is to critique other people's decisions, and I don't think that's a wise career strategy. I think it's much better to focus on them making better decisions. Finally, you have the design case, and it's like the choice case, except it doesn't give you the choices. And this gives you more of an opportunity for creativity and synthesis. And it's particularly useful when you're dealing with students who are reasonably sophisticated in the area so that they can come up with sensible designs and not just so fanciful alternatives that really would not make any sense in the real world. So once you've gathered all the information for your case, how do you actually go about organizing it? I recommend, unless you've got a lot of experience writing cases, the best approach might be to follow a kind of idealized drill-down organization of the type that I have in the Journal of IT Education Discussion Cases template. And basically, this organization starts out with a statement of the case and then moves you through a series of levels. So you start with an introduction, which basically is a summary of the decision. And this, in JITE DC, my journal, what we do is we require it to be a single page, no more, no less. And that basically becomes a page you can look at to determine if the case decision seems to be of any interest to you before going on further, which I think is useful for instructors. Once you get through the introduction, then you start dealing with high-level concepts like what's the industry like, what's the product like, what are the technologies like. If it's an international case, you might want to talk about the country and its economy. Then you drill down to the top level of the organization being studied, you move down to the business unit being studied, and then finally you come to the specific situation, which essentially is a more in-depth look at the situation that you introduced in the introduction. And this level here can have multiple sections. You might have a section on a specific technology, you might have a section on a specific country, you might have a section on a specific product, and they'd all be separate sections, but they provide the context needed for the student to make a sensible decision. And this is where you can actually put content that might otherwise be covered by lecture. And there's a good chance that the students will read it if they're preparing the case because they need to understand it in order to understand the decision. Now, when I talked about the idealized framework on the previous slide, I used the term idealized because in the real world, it's relatively rare that you get a situation that is so simple that you can apply the drill down without any thought. So if we take a look at what the drill down would suggest, we can imagine that we've got, an industry, a company, divisions, and so forth, that you can just basically move layer by layer down, getting more and more specific. But in the real world, what tends to happen is you tend to have a diagram that looks a lot messier. For example, in a higher education situation, you will have the education system, institution, the specific program. You're going to have courses, issues, instructors, departments. They overlap with each other. There's the research aspect, there's the discipline, there's the subject matter being covered. All of these things sort of make it harder to come up with an organization that's as clean as this. And so what you need to do is just give some thought as to how you're going to deal with these relationships, because in the context of a case, it's important that you give as accurate a depiction of the context as possible. And if the context is messy, it may take a little bit of creativity to get the write-up clean enough so that people can understand that without being overwhelmed by it. Now, another alternative organization is a pure narrative case where you simply tell the story. And I think this can be a very compelling organization. It can be very interesting to read. And so it does have some advantages. You may have some trouble getting it published, but on the other hand, it can be very engaging. It can be very flexible. There are lots of ways to tell a story. But The real drawback of this approach is that it can be very challenging to prepare and facilitate in a discussion context because neither your instructors nor your students are that used to this particular type of organization. So this is something that I would recommend you consider as you move to a more advanced stage in your case writing. Because there may be times when the benefits of being engaging and flexible outweigh the concerns of departing from the normal structure of a case for classroom discussion. Another thing that you need to think about when you're developing a discussion case is that you always have two audiences. And if you forget that, or if either of your audiences forget that, it will produce some major challenges in the development process. Now, one audience, of course, is the student audience. And the student audience is, to be served their needs, you've got to provide the necessary context of the case. You've got to introduce any frameworks you want the students to use when they're analyzing the case. You want to add some tension to the decision to make it interesting, and you want things to be as accurate as possible. Now, the other audience you have to worry about when you're developing a case is the client site, the organization where you're building the case, because ultimately they are going to have to approve the case before you can use it. Now, the client site is going to have somewhat different objectives. They are going to want you to create a case that makes them look as good as possible. I think in a previous chapter I referred to this as a showcase. And what you need to do when you're presenting a case is present it from the client's perspective. You do not want your voice as the case writers to suggest that you are critical of the client or the client's making the wrong decision. If you make that suggestion in the case, if they pick up on it, they are never going to approve it. Unless, of course, the management changed while you were writing the case and they want to make the old management who had the decision look as bad as possible. But that's a really rare situation. I always suggest using the term decision instead of problem. When academics use problem, they're frequently referring to it in the context of problem solving, which is, a positive activity. But the organization is going to hear the term problem, and there are very few organizations that want their problems spread out when they don't have to be. If you're looking at a case and it appears the decision making of the client is just incredibly flawed, I suggest walking away from the case. Don't develop it further. Do not try to get the case approved. You do not need to develop a case of flawed decision making. And if the client's there the first time it's discussed and it's clear that what you're doing in that case is making fun of the client, in a sense, you will never be able to deal with that client again. The other thing is when when you want to say good things about the company because the client really wants that, you can always do that in quotes. So instead of having you as the case writer say, this is a wonderful company to work for, find someone in the organization who says, this is a wonderful company to work for, and then quote that person in the case. That is completely accurate in terms of what you've done, but it doesn't force you to use your own voice to endorse the client, which you don't really want to do because you'll lose any sense of objectivity that you would have. So for the most part, you're not going to be able to write a discussion case in a vacuum, and you're going to need some approvals. Now, when you're writing a research case, normally the approval to do the research is granted at the beginning of the process, and you normally don't have an approval at the end because you don't want the organization essentially refusing to release your results if those results are not terribly positive. When you're dealing with a discussion case, however, the release is inevitably at the very end of the process, and therefore you can put in a lot of work for no result if the discussion case is not released. So what are some of the things you got to think about in the approval process? Well, first, depending upon your institution, before you even start writing the case, you may need to speak to an institutional review board. because cases do involve interacting with human beings and therefore could qualify as human subjects research. Now, there are three things that you could possibly get from your IRB. One might be approval as human subjects research, the second is exemption, and the third is inapplicable. And I would recommend going for the second two. At my institution, they decided that the structure of case research, particularly the type of research that I do with the Agile case method, doesn't really qualify as human subjects research under their definition because there's no experimental manipulation involved. And for our institution, experimental manipulation is an important part of human subjects research. So they basically gave me a decision that my research did not qualify as human subjects research. And I can honestly say it's the only time in my academic career when I'm glad to hear that my activity didn't qualify as research. But of course, it does qualify as research. It simply does not fit the human subjects framework because I'm not doing experimental manipulations. Exemption is also possible because you can get exempted from human subjects research when you're developing discussion cases in particular because they are a relatively standard educational tool, and the Code of Federal Regulations has a lot of exemptions for research done in the education area. This is probably a good thing because a vast number of things we do in education, such as giving exams, would not necessarily pass muster for IRB approval because they have the genuine potential to harm a student. Students aren't allowed to opt out. We don't give them informed consent to the exam. You know, they have to take it, you know, whether we tell them about it or not. I mean, there are all sorts of things that could make it extremely hard if it were a research project. And the folks in the Code of Federal Regulations understand that. So you might want to look for exemptions if they won't declare that the research doesn't fit the criteria of human subjects research. Now, if you are in an organization, there are sort of three levels of approval that you're going to need. The first is from individuals that you interview. What I tend to do is whenever I get quotes or write sections on an individual in the case, I tend to get their approval before I go to anyone else in the organization. So I never catch them by surprise with what I've written in the case because I don't want them to view me as a kind of efficiency expert who's going to basically cause them harm for their jobs. You know, that's the type of thing you negotiate with the organization before you start writing the case. Then the next thing you need is approval from the protagonist, and usually the protagonist gets the full draft, which is why I like to approach the individuals first. And then after the protagonist, approves the case, then there may be some additional release required. For example, the protagonist might have to go to his or her boss, and there's typically a release form. I've got one in Informing with the Case method that goes through this. And in the release form, you probably want to clarify copyright in particular. You know, you want to find out if the company is going to have the right to make unlimited copies of the case, which is something that you might have to alert if you're going to publish it with the publisher, because some publishers don't like that, and you don't want the publisher suing your company because they're copying your case. And so those are things that you can typically deal with in the release process. And in Informing with the Case method, I have a case writing checklist as an appendix. I'm planning on creating some videos on that, and those go into this process in a little bit richer detail. A lot of times, if you're going to publish a case, the publisher will require a teaching note, or at least strongly request one, because having a teaching note will often make it much, much easier for other instructors to use the case that you have written. Now, a typical teaching note has a number of different components. These include sort of synopsis of the case. A lot of instructors prefer to go through teaching notes than the case itself in trying to decide on what case to do. They might have a set of learning objectives that'll help the instructor decide whether or not it's relevant to their particular course or learning objectives. It'll probably have some analytical frameworks. This is a requirement of, say, the North American Case Research Association, which oddly enough publishes discussion cases only. But this is where you bring the, quote, research rigor into your case. Needless to say, I never look at these analytical frameworks. In fact, I never look at teaching notes. But nevertheless, this is something that will help instructors who are trying to figure out how to get value out of the case in the context of a more traditional academic course. Typically, there'll be a discussion roadmap. Some go so far as to suggest how long you should spend on each topic, though for my part, I can't even imagine having that much control over a class. I've never had that kind of control, but nonetheless, some people are very effective. I suspect there's a certain amount of lecturing via the case method going on there. And then they will often have discussion questions. Discussion questions, when I have a classroom case, I have not really used in the past, but I've started to use them a little bit more because I'm starting to get very large classes, and what I will do is before the class starts, I will choose one of the 8 or 9 discussion case questions and require the students to spend about 20 minutes writing a response to it and then uploading it to our website, Canvas. And what that does is it forces people who might not otherwise read the case carefully to put some time into at least looking at those questions. In a smaller class, I don't have to do that because in a small class, most of the students will have the opportunity to open the course, and that tends to motivate a higher level of preparation. When I teach a case online, the discussion questions can be extremely useful because what I do is I use those questions as the starting point for an asynchronous discussion. It allows me to get a whole bunch of threads going at once. The case teaching note typically ends with a summary of the case, and sometimes it will include outcomes. Because I'm interested in complex landscapes, I'm not normally that obsessed with knowing the outcomes of the decision in a case, but for a lot of students and instructors, that's very important because, in a sense, they're craving a right answer. But this is how a teaching note might typically look, and I think I have an example of a teaching note in the Informing with the Case Method book, but it is something that at least in the eyes of the North American Case Research Association, makes a discussion case a true form of research, particularly because you have these analytical frameworks embedded in it. So once you've written a discussion case, it would really be a shame not to publish it. And there are actually a lot of outlets that will allow you to publish discussion cases, particularly if you've written a teaching note with it. And I'll just mention some of these. Let me caution you up front, as I have said on a number of occasions, you do not get a lot of academic credit for publishing discussion cases, though you might at some teaching institutions, but not so much at research institutions. Nevertheless, I believe that there is tremendous value in sharing your cases, particularly if you share them open source so that people don't have to spend the ridiculous amount of money associated with buying Harvard cases. So where can you publish these things? Well, a lot of conferences, ISIS, Academy of Management, DSI, the Insight Conference of the Informing Science Institute give you the opportunity to publish discussion cases, and I think those are good alternatives. My only complaint with conferences is they expect you to present the discussion case rather than discuss it, which basically means that you end up lecturing a case, which is something I can't bear to do. And we haven't really figured out a good way to use these cases in conferences because nobody comes into a presentation prepared, so you can't really have a regular discussion. But on the other hand, they are good places to get your cases out. Another alternative is various repositories. The Ivy repository at the University of Western Ontario, HBS's repository, though, you basically need to know an HBS faculty and bring them on as a co-author if you want to publish there. The Case Center, which used to be the European Case Clearinghouse, publishes cases, runs some competitions. The Informing Science Institute has one repository, Informing Faculty, which has the narrow focus of publishing cases that deal with higher education situations, discussion cases on higher education situations. And it's a repository, not really a journal. It does have volumes, but the number of issues in each volume can vary considerably, and I think it's only got 2 volumes. Let's see, we've got disciplinary journals. For example, the Journal of IT Education discussion cases. My journal publishes discussion cases in the information technology area. There are a number of journals in the IT area that publish discussion cases, and there are also some in management. And I think in any particular discipline, you'll probably find some outlets if you look for them. Another place is specific discussion case journals. The North American Case Research Association has a really nice journal of discussion cases. They also have an excellent conference that provides some really nice mentorship for people learning to write discussion cases. They do have a specific requirement for a teaching note and various other requirements. And whenever you're publishing a case, you really ought to look at the requirements even before you write the case, so you don't end up writing a 10,000 word case when the limit is 5,000 for the particular outlet you want. Been there, done that. So this is something that you need to think about in advance. There are also books of cases. For example, Ray Goldberg, one of the faculty members who coined the term agribusiness in the 1950s, has a long series of books of agribusiness cases. I recently published a book of discussion cases in Vietnam, and I'll be working on another of discussion cases in the area of cybersecurity. And I think, especially if you're dealing with the Informing Science Institute, it should be relatively easy to put together books of cases. And finally, there are the self-publish on the internet. And a lot of my own local cases, that's all I did with them because I didn't get a lot of academic credit. The big thing was just to get them out and available. So most of the cases that I've written, except those that are published under extreme copyright conditions, are up on my personal website so that people can download them and use them if they have any interest in doing that. And I think all of these things are a good way of getting your cases out, and since cases from some sources, such as the HBS Press, are very expensive, especially if there are a lot of them, and especially if you're in a country where money is scarce, I think that it's great to have open source availability of cases. So to kind of wrap up the topic, writing discussion cases, I would like to make one point that I have not necessarily made clear about discussion cases, and one of my principal motivations. When you think about all the forms of business research that you might do, the discussion case is the only research activity that I can think of that takes the research that you do on site and makes it immediately accessible to the classroom. And we're constantly complaining about the impact of business research, with considerable justification, I might add. And yet, the lowly discussion case allows you to virtually guarantee that your research will impact your students. It's most likely to impact the individuals that you're writing the case with. In most of the cases I have written, the protagonists, the individuals who are the central focus of the case, have indicated that the case really had an impact on their decision. And so, as a result, this lowly form of research that you don't necessarily get much credit for, nevertheless, is one of the most impactful things that you can do. And institutions like HBS understand that. Writing case studies is very central to the strategy of HBS because it leads to consulting engagements, board memberships, big donations, and a very close tie-in with the practitioner community, which is the way HBS sells itself. And so top tier institutions recognize this important. I think it's a terrible mistake to think about the case study as being simply a document that you produce that's used in the classroom but has no benefit for your career. So, to sort of summarize what I talked about in this lecture, when you talk about writing discussion cases, your principal goal is not normally going to be publication, though I think you should publish every discussion case you write. There's got to be an outlet for almost any case that's well written, and I think you should share them. But that's not going to be your principal motivation. The choice of site and topic are often opportunistic. Ultimately, the best cases are written around interesting decisions, and you can't necessarily predict what the interesting decision is going to be when you go into a site. So I think you're better off abandoning your preconceptions and just going with something that seems interesting. Alternative learning objectives are possible. We talked about sense making, which builds on intelligence, choice, building on choice, design, building on design. So you have all three elements of intelligence, design, choice available to you in how you write your cases. There's nearly always a decision involved in a discussion case. As soon as you start to write a discussion case that is not centered around protagonist decision, you really got to think carefully about that, because it's going to be much harder to use in the classroom than one that does have a decision. And particularly if you're dealing with people who do not have a lot of experience discussing cases, it will confuse the students and make it much, much harder to manage the discussion. Students and client sites are both audiences for your cases. So when you're writing a case, never forget the students who are going to be discussing the case or the clients who need to approve the case, because if you forget either one of those, you're not going to have a very effective case. And finally, there are a lot of publication outlets for cases, discussion cases. Do not let people tell you you can't publish discussion cases. The fact is the outlets exist, and even if you don't use them, self-publishing the case in today's internet makes things available. And I strongly encourage you to write cases of this nature, because I think it is one of the most effective ways of building bridges between academics and practice, and I think that is something that will benefit all of us.